Hey, Journeys Crossing. I'm excited about today, and I'm also nervous because today what we'll be talking about is the beginning of a much longer and broader conversation that is long overdue. And I'll explain in just a moment why it's challenging, as many of you probably know. But if you have not crawled out from underneath a stone lately, you know that our media has been saturated with news of just horrible situations. On May 25th, we probably know that Minneapolis police officers arrested George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man, after a deli employee called 911 because he was buying cigarettes, what they thought was with a counterfeit $20 bill. But what happens, as many of us have seen in that video, is totally unacceptable. We see the last minutes of his life ebb away as police officers kneel on his neck and as they press him to the ground, and we hear him screaming, "I can't breathe," and he cries for his mother. You can't watch that video and not be torn up inside when we see someone's life taken so quickly and so needlessly. The problem is that this is just one story in a string of thousands. But it has become a tipping point, a sort of, I think, Band-Aid that's being ripped off of something that's been bubbling underneath our culture for centuries. And I'm excited that we begin this conversation at Journeys Crossing and take it to another level, but I'm also very nervous. I'm scared, and not so scared that I don't think we should have this conversation. But if you're a person who follows social media of any sorts, or you follow the news, you see that there are so many different perspectives on this. And I know, without a shadow of a doubt, that there will be plenty who disagree with something that I say or something that's said up here today. And then there will be people on the other side who say, we didn't say enough, or we have much more that needs to be said. But regardless, I think the important thing is that we are having the courage to begin this conversation that's long overdue. And my hope and my conviction is that we will find ourselves in a new time in our nation where racism, systemic racism, injustice, prejudice towards people of different ethnicity or skin color, that those things largely begin to fade away in a way that never has up to this point in our nation's history. That is my hope. That is many of our hopes. That is our dream. And as a part of our conversation today, I want to share with you some biblical underpinnings quickly. And then the part that I'm most excited about is I have some friends up here who are people of color, my black friends, brothers and sisters, who get to share their perspective, who get to share some of the solutions that they think we should suggest. And I think we should all lean in and listen, close our mouths, be unjudgmental, be undefensive, and simply listen, because we have not done that enough. Let's talk for a moment. Some of you might be wondering why me, a white guy, would even prompt this conversation, or if I even have a clue about what's been going on in our black community or other communities of ethnic minorities. I don't. I don't know to the full extent of which those friends of ours have suffered for generations. I can never totally understand the pain, the anger, the hurt that these friends of ours have been carrying in a day in and day out moment. But it's important that we talk about it. You may not know this about me, but there are several reasons why this compels me and compels our church to have this conversation. One, if you're a part of Journeys Crossing, you know that we are largely a multicultural church. We have people from a multitude of diversities, from just about every nation or continent on this planet. Almost 50% of our community are made up of ethnic minorities. We have less than 50% of our church would be recognized as white. And because I see the fear and the hurt and the deep pain in my brothers and sisters of color, we must talk about this. Not in a one and done kind of a deal, but at the beginning of a conversation. And we have some initiatives that we as a church want to step up and begin doing to be actively taking a role in our community to change some of the things that have gone on for too long. So this matters deeply to me because you matter deeply to me, and I see and hear your pain. It also matters deeply to me because as a child, in my kind of roots, my parents had the courage and the wisdom to expose me to a lot of different cultures. I can remember, still blazed in my mind, when I was 4 and 5 years old, during the riots in Cincinnati in the 1960s, how our family was one of the few white families that attended an all-black church in the inner city in a basement of a tenement building in the projects. And those were my very first church family. Those were my first friends. Those were my church mamas and fathers and uncles and aunts. And I remember driving through Cincinnati one evening after a racial period of violence and rioting to see the burned out shells of the liquor store and some of the other businesses and being deeply moved at what I saw happening. It's hard to believe that 50 years from that moment, not enough has changed. But I care deeply about people of all races, just as God does and as many as you do. You probably also know this matters to me because soon after that, my parents took me to Japan as missionaries. And I spent the most of my childhood largely as a minority. And I know some of what it feels like to be talked about behind your back, to actually be, as you walk down the street, being yelled at and fingers pointed every time you would go out, Gaijin da, which simply means, there's an outsider. I know what it feels like to not fit in, to not know the code, to have people, moving away from you out of suspicion. I know a little. I don't know nearly the pain that some of our black friends and people of color experience. But I know enough to know that we must speak out. And I could go on about my experiences, and God has been fortunate to give me little windows in experience injustice or prejudice or discrimination. But I know that as a white person in this country, I largely have privilege. And there are many things that I'm able to do, many things I'm able to buy or places to go and conversations that I can have, situations that I would never ever think about something dangerous happening to me or people having certain attitudes to them. And that's not simply true for so many of our community. And that must stop. Why should these things stop? They should stop because racism in all of its forms and prejudice is sinful. And it breaks the heart of God. It should motivate us because we know that God's dream is to create his church united of people of multitude of languages and colors as we will one day in heaven. And that God's call has been for his church here on earth to be the kingdom represented. More than 90% of churches in America today are predominantly one ethnic race. There are less than 10% of churches here in America that have more than or less than 80% of a single dominant ethnic group. I am so blessed to be a part of a family that we are an anomaly. And we're making some strides and we're experiencing the blessing of diversity and connection with people who are different than we are. And I know that God wants his church, wherever it would be, to be different than it is today. And while we have made some progress, while we have this blessing of being together, we are not doing enough. And I want this to be a line in the sand for us at Journeys Crossing, where we determine to do better, where we pledge to support and love our friends whose skin color may be different than us, whose heritage may be different than us, because we are to be one. Not only to support and to encourage and to listen, but we also need to be a church of people that will stand up for the injustices around us, that will defend and speak out even when it costs us something. And I hope as you listen to this today that you will turn off all of your political ideology and that you will realize this isn't political, this is personal. And this is God's dream for his church from the very beginning. It matters to me personally, and it matters deeply to God. I'll be honest, I am becoming more aware of the racial inequities that happen even here in Montgomery County, more so than ever, because my family is becoming more diverse. I have 3 son-in-laws who are people of color. I have 2 grandchildren who are biracial. And as I hear their stories, as I watch their pain, and as I think about the future of my grandchildren, I want them to grow up in a different world. And I want this to be true for the families of Journeys Crossing, all of them, no matter whether they're black or white or brown, whether we're Asian, rich or poor, we are all equals. We are all in need of falling at the foot of the cross. And so I hope this is the beginning of that conversation. See, 3 simple biblical ideas that you must derive all of your theology in this issue around before I introduce some guests and we enter into a time of conversation. First, you need to know that there is no such thing as a superior or an inferior race. The scripture is very clear that in Genesis chapter 1, it says, so God created man, humanity, in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And in the New Testament, we see this building to where the early church says in Acts 17, and from one man, one human, he made every nation of people that they should inhabit the whole of earth. We're not a planet of races. We have one race, the human race. And we have far more in common than many would realize. And the differences that we have are to be celebrated as blessings. There are no such thing as one race being superior or inferior, and therefore must be treated equally with equal privilege and equal rights and equal benefits. Here's the second thing. The root of the problem that causes the racism and the systemic issues in our nation and around the world, this is not new here in 2020. This has been a problem since day one, when Cain looked at his brother Abel and murdered him and told God, I am not my brother's keeper. We are called to be our brothers and sisters' keepers. Because the root of this problem is not a skin problem. It really is a sin problem. And when we look at scriptures, like we see in Galatians chapter 5, verse 19, we see a listing of too many attitudes that I have and you have had. The acts of the sinful nature are obvious: sexual immorality and impurity and debauchery and idolatry and witchcraft. Now, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. Do you catch that center part that sounds way too much like what's going on in our world today? That's because at the issue is a heart problem. And yes, we need to be people who legislate and we make decisions in our nation so that people are accountable for their grievous acts that they do to other human beings. But ultimately, We can't legislate a person's heart. That's why the real crux of the matter comes down to this third thought, that the church, that we, the church, God's people, are the best hope we have to defeat racism. Not if our church stays the same. Not if the church of Jesus Christ around the world doesn't amend its ways. But we innately have the power, because the power of God is to transform hearts. And people's hearts need to be transformed, beginning with mine and beginning with yours. And that is why we have this conversation. Not because it's some political dialogue, but because at the very heart of the matter, it matters to God. And from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible, if you're willing to see it, you see a theme of the priority of justice. And you see again and again where God's people who've experienced what it feels like to be in bondage, to then begin treating others as though they're inferior, and to use religion as a backdrop and an excuse for their behavior. This happened over and over again to the Israelite people, so much that God was frustrated, and writes in the prophets and the minor and the major prophets how this was becoming detestable in his sight, that they weren't loving the foreigner among them, the immigrant, those that were different from them, and that they would then worship and do all of the external things to feel good and to look good, but didn't change what happened within. And we see at the birth of the church in the New Testament an amazing, very beginning collection of people who heard languages from all over the world. It's God's way of saying this right here has got to be fundamentally one of the most important priorities of his children, his family, his church. And yet it's not. And I want it to be different for us. For those of us who call Journeys Crossing home, that this will be a time where you will be willing to step up, and you will be willing to speak out, that we will be willing to be gracious and kind, but to help others who don't hold these values and help them discover them and help them find Jesus, because ultimately Jesus is going to transform us, this church, and this nation. Paul says this, and this will be my last passage before we engage in this wider conversation. In the book of Ephesians, he says, "Therefore, remember the formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, that at that time you were separate from Christ." The early church took this a priority of bringing peoples together, excluded from citizenship in Israel and foreigners to the covenants of the promises, without hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near because of the blood of Jesus. Why? For he himself is our peace, who has made the two one and destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new man out of the two, making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them, all of us, through the cross. And then we read in 2 Corinthians 5:18 what our responsibility is. "And all things are of God, who has reconciled us to himself by Jesus Christ, and has given you," me, everyone watching this screen who's a follower of Jesus Christ, God has given you the ministry of reconciliation, of bringing this peace that we receive from Jesus and giving it to those around us, regardless of what they look like, where they've come from, where they've been. And it has to start in the house of God. Sometimes, though, before we can stand up together against some injustice, it's important that we sit down together. So I want to invite some friends up right now to continue this conversation, because they know much more about this than I do. And I want us to listen, and I want us to hear, and I want us to learn, so that we can move forward from today. Would you welcome my friends? All right, I'm excited about this next portion of our conversation because we've invited some Journeys Crossing friends to join this conversation who are people of color, who understand personally some of the pain. And what we want to do as a community is to listen and come up with some action ideas that we as a church can begin taking to be the change agents we want our church to be. So I want to introduce to you, this is Tim Walker, Carla Rush, Addie Momeyer, and Kevin Page. Thank you so much. I feel like I'm on one of those talk shows, you know? As long as it's not Maury or something, we're okay, right? So why don't you guys just give a brief introduction, tell us a little bit about yourself, how long you've been coming to Journeys Crossing, family stuff, what you do, whatever you think would be helpful for people that don't know you. We'll start with you, Tim.
All right. Again, my name is Tim Walker. I've been coming to Journeys Crossing for about 7 years. Married the 3 years in August to my wife Sharon. We have a blended family, 3 kids. I'm a chef for a hotel chain, and just glad to be here.
An amazing cook, chef. I mean, ooh, yeah.
Thank you.
Carla.
I'm Carla Rush. My beautiful family, my husband John, and our 4 children have been coming to JC for about 15 years. I'm a stay-at-home mom and a community volunteer.
Yeah, you are involved as the NAACPA person for Montgomery County,
yes,
right?
I am the NAACP Parent Council rep at Churchill High School. Through the years, I've been the rep at Beverly Farms Elementary and Hoover Middle School. So as my kids progress through, I have as well.
That's awesome.
It's a great organization.
Yeah, it is. And I'm glad, I mean, that just, there's more to listen to. Your experience is going to be really helpful, I think, in this conversation as well. Addie?
Hi, I'm Addie Momeyer. My husband Tim and I and our 3 kids have been coming to Journeys Crossing since 2012. I am currently a stay-at-home mom. I am also an attorney. I spent the bulk of my career doing public interest work at the Maryland Legal Aid Bureau, representing poor and low-income members of different communities throughout the state of Maryland. And I'm really happy to be here and hoping that some great things will come out of this conversation today.
I'm Kevin Page. Been coming to Journeys Crossing since 2008, so for 12 years. Yes, that's right. We got here in 2008, like I said. We've, Branding, my wife, been married almost 20 years, and we have 3 beautiful daughters. The oldest, which just recently graduated high school, so
Congrats.
Shout out to Lex. Excited to be here, excited to, get this conversation started, and, it's time. So thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And I know all of you before this, and I know your hearts, and I don't know all of your story, but I'm eager to find out more. One of the things I think we said earlier as we were talking is, while we're starting this conversation here kind of in a more determined manner as a church, for many of you, it's just been a conversation that has been something that's been your entire life. And that must be exhausting. Anybody want to speak to that?
Well, I think it's interesting that this latest incident is the one that's brought us to this point of outrage, because these videos are a continuous thing. The year changes, maybe the sex changes, the name changes, but the race is always the same. And I'm not sure what's brought everyone across racial lines to this point of outrage, to where there's protests and people finally speaking up saying it's not right. It's atrocious acts that are taking place against the people of color. It's got to stop.
Absolutely. And it's not just, this isn't a conversation just about maybe police brutality. That's one piece of the puzzle. But I think what people need to know is that there are layers to this that you've experienced all your lives. And I think white people like myself, we really, as though some of us try to understand, but we haven't lived in your shoes. And I think it's important for us to hear there's lots of different ways that this happens to you, even today, even in Montgomery County. I mean, I think in one way, Montgomery County, we have this idea that, hey, we live in this highly diverse place and we've kind of broken past these racial issues. But that's not the case. And sometimes that can be a barrier to us because it's kind of this panacea that we think it's all kind of all okay, but it's not. And these things coming to the surface just, I think, force us to have a greater conversation that's way overdue, right? What are some of the ways that you experience racism, like on even a daily basis, that a lot of us who are white would not understand or even think about? And I know it's hard. Some of you may feel like you talk about this or it's being talked about enough, but I think it's important that those of us who are at Journeys Crossing who aren't Black understand that these things still happen. And they're not all these large, brutal things. Many of them are just kind of systemic issues that we've become numb to or you don't realize they exist. Share some of your experiences.
Well, I think a good way to jump in that to jump into that discussion is to really help people understand what people of color are talking about when we talk about white privilege and when we talk about systemic racism. Because I think, unfortunately, there is a knee-jerk reaction for people on the other side of that conversation to become very defensive when when they hear white privilege. And I think it needs to be understood that, and I'll speak for myself personally, I am not expecting, my white friends, my white brothers and sisters, or anyone white for that matter, to apologize for being white any more than I would be expected to apologize for being Black. But I think in order to really understand this conversation, you have to understand that when we say white privilege, we need folks to understand that just by virtue of the fact that we are people of color, there are situations that we have to deal with and circumstances that we encounter every single day that people who are white don't understand and don't have to deal with. And so when you come from a place of defensiveness or you don't acknowledge that white privilege exists, it's like you're minimizing what we are experiencing every day. And if you're not able to even acknowledge that it exists, then it's going to be really difficult to get to a point where we can have a discussion about how to eradicate it. And that kind of ties in with the discussion about systemic racism. A lot of times when you talk about racism, people become defensive and say, well, I'm not racist. I have Black friends. I have Black colleagues. I'm not a racist person. But systemic racism is more, it's ingrained in pretty much everything that we do in society. It becomes, it's so insidious that it infects the way we think and the way we see things, and sometimes we don't even realize it. And I'll give you an example of that because you asked about how racism has affected us, and I use this example because it's kind of vanilla, but I think if you can understand how this equates to systemic racism, then you can kind of understand how it leads into bigger things. So when Jasmine was born, Tim and I lived in Tacoma Park, which is a very racially diverse area, very highly Hispanic community. So it wasn't an area where you'd be surprised to see people of color or big couples or anything like that. And there was a day I had just taken Maya to the bus stop. I was walking back. I had Jasmine in the little carrier on my chest. And there was an older white lady walking the same direction as I was walking. And she started speaking to me. We talked for a second. And she said, "Oh, the baby is so cute. Are you her nanny?" And that might, to some people who don't understand what systemic racism is, might think, oh, well, she just didn't know. But you have to ask yourself, if she saw a white woman with a black baby, she probably would have thought, oh, she just adopted this little black baby.
Right.
And so this idea that you see someone, a black woman with a baby that you think is white, and you automatically assume that I'm the hired help and not the child's mother.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thought processes that we as a society sometimes have, and I think is indicative of systemic racism.
Yeah. I would just mention, for those that don't know Addie, that you're married to Tim, who is a white guy, right? So your children don't necessarily have your complexion or Tim's. It could be a combination of, or somewhere in between. So that's what prompts some of that microaggression, micro kind of assumptions that people are making that we would never even imagine, but they happen to you all the time, right?
That's what's exhausting, the microaggressions on a daily basis. It's cumulative.
Yeah.
So you sort of build up an armor, you're expecting, and most likely you're going to get them. It's you can speak out on them, though. I mean, that's part of bringing a greater understanding to it, is if that's said to you, why would you ask that? Why would you ask if I'm the nanny?
Mm-hmm.
What made you come to that conclusion?
Yeah.
You call people on it sometimes, and then they think about their own actions. That's part of understanding your own privilege. It's not about what you have access to having privilege. It's about what you haven't had to go through. Mm-hmm. So if you can accept your privilege and analyze it, then you can maybe see where you can use your privilege to help someone who's maybe in the opposite position, someone who doesn't have that same privilege.
Yeah, there's so much of this that I don't think those of us who are white, I want to say dear white people kind of a thing, we don't know. And because we don't know it, we have a hard time knowing that we should correct it. But I'm hearing more and more of this stuff, and it's like light bulbs going on for me that just say, oh my gosh, that's horrible. This has got to be exhausting. Friends that tell me if they go grocery shopping, they could be wearing $1,000 suit and be a black man, and then watch all the white ladies move their carts to the aisle sides or move their pocketbooks or whatever. Or you walk across a street and then you hear the clicks of doors locking. I mean,
Correct.
That wouldn't happen to white people,
And sometimes just being a black man in America, you have to really think forward how to dress yourself in the morning. Mm. What should you wear to be accepted from others? And maybe you don't have to deal with that, but sometimes it's all about the colors you wear, how you wear your hat or your baseball cap, just to be accepted by others. And it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be like the color of your skin or how you dress or how you look.
Absolutely not.
It's just like me going into Nordstrom's and wearing sweatpants and Timberland boots. They're looking at me thinking I'm about to steal something, which I'm just browsing and shopping like everyone else. And then when I put my Nordstrom card down, it'd be like mindset changes. Hey, Mr. Walker, how you doing? Welcome back to Nordstrom's. But when I walked in the door, it was a whole different perspective. And those are the things that we have to deal with every day.
I mean, people watching this may think, okay, that's a big difference between, Nordstrom and getting the look and the questions and then what happened to George Floyd. But I think it's important for people to know that when the way that you enter the world every day is dramatically different, the mindset, the posture, you're always on alert. That white people don't necessarily have to face the world that way. And when you have to always be watching your behavior or thinking, is this going to do something? I can't imagine how exhausting that must be. And that's what we're talking about.
Sorry, it literally boils down to that. Like Tim said, you think about what you're going to wear. Of course, everyone thinks about what they're going to wear and, is someone going to like this particular shirt or this particular dress or skirt? For me, it's you already feel piercing eyes, especially growing up where I did. You just have piercing eyes just from walking down the street, just that people are disgusted at your existence, your mere existence. But then it boils down to, okay, when I wear this shirt, not only is someone going to like this shirt, it's, well, they're going to perceive me this way. Like it even gets down to the minutia of what I'm going to wear. How is this going to perceive? How many piercing eyes are going to be? And you're right, it is exhausting. We live it every day. But it's just, and I don't know how many people, go through that again, but I know for me, it is an everyday thing of just piercing eyes, just walking down the street or walking down and the doors locking and, moving the cars to the side or, just the grotesque of my existence in someone's world. It is a constant thing, even here in Montgomery County.
Yeah. So I think it's important that those of us who are white, we have to be as diligent about our own behaviors and catch ourselves and also catch one another when those kinds of behaviors surface. We have to speak out when we see another friend do something like, just because a black man walks across the street, now all the doors locked, or we have to begin monitoring and changing our behaviors and realize this is a pattern if we're going to change that thing. And I think we have to change our hearts by embracing and learning to see. The difference to me is people may say, I don't hate black people, but we don't realize that indifference or apathy is the true opposite of love. Hate is not the opposite of love. Indifference, apathy is the opposite of love. Love is choosing to serve, to care for another being. Indifference, where you don't care about this or it's going towards the hatred side, those are completely opposite of the call for us as Christians to have anything in our life look like that.
And saying that you have black friends is not, proximity to blackness doesn't make you not a racist.
Right.
It is purposeful, intentional work that goes into not being a racist. It is being aware of what you are doing every day, and even so far as being an ally in this fight, is you calling out your friends who are making these racist comments, racist jokes, and saying, that's not right. That's racist what you just said.
Right. That assumption is racist, right? There's so much beneath it. It doesn't even have to be this aggressive behavior that we have to learn to confront one another about. It can be what could be a neutral seeming behavior, but it's really not, because it has this stereotype or this imaging built into it that's wrong, right?
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, you started this conversation off talking, taking it back to a biblical place. And I think it's really important, as a society at large, for us to be having this conversation, but particularly as Christ followers. And I believe in the book of James, it talks about us bearing one another's burdens.
Right.
And just as you were alluding to the exhaustion that people in the Black community have, it is exhaustion, and we can't overcome this just on our own. We need people outside of the Black community, in the white community, who say that they, are behind this, to not only be behind it in their words, but be behind it in your actions. As just was said, think about your own interactions. That conversation that, the white coworkers are having that may be racially insensitive when there aren't any people of color around to hear it. And also, being willing to really step up. Words are great, but at the end of it, it's what are you willing to do to see a difference happen? And I think as Christ followers, more than just the average Joe, I think just as human beings, we're all called to act, but specifically as people of faith. This has to be something that we take seriously and that we decide we're going to be active and progressive about.
Absolutely. We talked a little bit earlier about this idea where there may be those who come, like a church at Journeys Crossing, where we worship together and we sing together, and there is this great diversity, but realize that what we're experiencing together on maybe a Sunday when we're in person, or needs to go beyond that, so it's a Monday through Saturday kind of a thing. You can't just say, well, I go to church where we have lots of different people from.
And when you look at your friendship circle, your true friendship circle,
Right.
what does that look like? Your friendship circle has to be diverse for you to really understand the issues that people of color are facing, for you to really have a good grasp of it. It's not something that you just say, oh yeah, I know Carla, yeah, she's my friend. Am I hanging out with you on a regular basis? It's important.
It's not Facebook friends, right? To your point. It's not just
Exactly,
Facebook friends.
not
That's
just
not
Facebook
a
friends.
friend. That's an acquaintance.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Go
Just
ahead.
reaching out as far as your true friends, instead of just meeting them on Sunday, reach out to them the week, if they need something from you, or, if you can help them with anything, that will show your generosity of being a true friend, not just waiting till Sunday to see you and say, how was your week? What did you do? Or, if you're going out for a beer or a drink, let's meet up on a Wednesday or something. Let's just talk about, just
Let's do life together, right?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's what it is.
I think we have to be intentional and purposeful about inviting people who may be different than us into our inner circle. And we have to be hungry to learn and to suspend judgment and to hear and to embrace with grace. And when that begins to happen, it's a blessing.
Yes.
I think people that haven't done that in their circles of friendship, inviting a diversity of people, are missing out. But that's a very important thing that those of us at Journeys Crossing can do, is to be intentional about having those in-between Sunday relationships that are much deeper than Facebook.
Yes.
I think, and my wife and I have talked about this, the genuineness of just the question, how are you doing? I think we miss that. And my wife and I, like I said, we talked about it. Scott Velasquez is great at that, because you can see it in his eyes. When he asks you, how are you doing? Like, he really wants to know how you're doing. It's not just a passive,
Right.
how are you doing? Like,
There's
that's
that
how
burning.
you get to know
Right.
someone. Like, that's
Care.
how, are you hurting? Like,
Right.
it's not just a, hey, how you doing? I really don't want to know. I don't want to hear exactly what you're going through. I'm just reaching out to be kind,
Right.
kind of thing.
And then listen.
Absolutely.
Ask the question and then sit down and listen.
Sometimes it's okay to just shut up.
Oh, a lot of times it's okay to shut up.
That's the most important part of talking, is listen
Yeah.
and don't say nothing and absorb the information.
Everyone should be slow to speak and quick to listen. Absolutely.
I've heard that somewhere.
Book of James. My middle name.
Is there anything else that there's so much, we could talk about this for a long time. But I do want us to kind of pivot and say, what are additional specific things that we should challenge our church to do as we leave this place?
I think people of other race and majority of white race, as far as putting their self in our situation, put their compassion as far as how we feel, or if someone would say a racial joke or anything like that. If they say that to you, how would you feel in the situation? Regardless if it was a black-white thing, but as a person itself, you would be hurt. You wouldn't want nobody to talk about your mother or your family. So that's pretty much what you're saying, because that's where I come from. I come from my mother. So when you say something that hurts me, you're hurting my whole family.
Sure.
And we try, as Christ followers, we try to not to attack and anger, but is angry, and sometimes it comes off bad, but we just being truthful how we really feel. And you hurt me, and I don't think you should say that. And I think you should, understand that words do hurt, and you need to understand that you might want to be more conscious of what you say before you say something, because if you hurt me, maybe somebody else that loves me gonna hurt you, and then that's a whole war that we don't want to deal with.
No, absolutely
We
not.
want to greet everybody in peace and love, and that's the way we should be.
Looking out for each other's interests over our own is what Paul said. And this is definitely a time for us to do that for our Black friends and the Black community of our world.
I think if I could nutshell it in three things that I think is a way to start, because obviously there's no way to line up every single thing that needs to be done. I think the first thing is something that we've already talked about, which is acknowledgement and understanding. Understanding where people of color are coming from, understanding the things that we have to deal with, understanding how we feel having to talk to our children about how to interact if they're pulled over by the police, or just understanding is so important, because I think that goes a long way to get past the defensiveness. I think the second thing is doing a gut check, asking ourselves, what are we doing? How are we interacting with people of color? How are we acting when we're in groups where there is no color? And I think the third thing that is even more important in my mind is being willing to actively advocate for change. And that's going to look different for different people, but you have to be willing to be progressive and be willing to speak out, and in your voting, selecting candidates who are going to be behind this this agenda, being willing to speak out publicly about what's wrong, not just calling up your Black friends and say, "Oh, I'm with you," but kind of letting us deal with the heavy lifting. We need our white brothers and sisters to be out there with us, not just protesting and holding up signs, but actually advocating in ways that are really going to help us see some change.
And also understanding in your circle, you may be the only ambassador to this type of change. So realizing how you speak about it and how you present it as important to you, how humankind is treated, not just Black folks. It's a human thing.
Right. It's decency and consideration
Exactly.
and all those things that we should show. We're not talking about, something that's this grand. It's just simply treating one another right. And there's a whole community of people that we haven't been treating well.
And I just want to add something. I know there's been some controversy about people using the hashtag Black Lives Matter. And
people like to say, well, all lives matter.
Yes,
right?
all lives do matter. That is certainly true, including Black lives. But I think when you say all lives matter in response to someone saying Black Lives Matter, it just shows that your lack of understanding that Black lives are the ones that are being targeted.
Right.
It's Black people who are the victims of police brutality. It's Black people who are suffering economically. Even in this age of COVID, we see the disparity between how COVID is affecting people of color because of the inequities in healthcare and economics and all of those things. So don't be defensive when someone says Black Lives Matter. We're not saying only Black Lives Matter. We just want the acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter too.
Exactly.
I think our society has gotten to that where it's just a reaction. Like you have to react immediately. I mean, especially
Correct.
social media.
Point and click. Yeah.
Absolutely, point and click. Again, it's shut up, listen, and absorb. Instead of just responding just quickly. Take the time to educate yourself. Do some reading. Don't just go by something you saw, what someone posted about someone else or about this is what's
Right.
going on in this community. The black community does this, and
Well,
educate
get to
yourself.
know some
Educate
some
yourself and
friends
get to
of
know,
color,
absolutely.
and you can hear the truth. Don't get all your information off of the media or social media, right?
Yeah.
The best place is to have a heart to heart.
There are lots of good books as far as educating yourself about this. Lots of good books out there about how to be an
Recommendations?
ally. Oh my,
We could post them. I mean,
that would
if
be
you want
great.
to say, yeah,
I
we
do,
could
I
post
do
these
have
later.
a few. I recently read a book. I'm forgetting the author's name. So you want to talk about race? It's really good. One that's getting a lot of attention now, I think, is White Fragility. I think is the name of it. Also, Stamped. There's a reworking of a classic book, Stamped. Is a reworking now that's geared more toward young adult teenagers. It's really good. It just spells out sort of the history of black oppression in this country.
Wow.
It really spells it out and puts it easy to understand. And I want to say, this affects everyone. It may seem like this is just about communities of color, but when your brother is down, you can't be 100%
Right.
good with that. You just can't. I mean, morally, it's not about politics. It's where you are aligning yourself morally, and where you're going to come down on this fight on the wrong or the right side of it.
Do you care?
Do you care?
I mean, it's basic compassion. Right? One of the things, as we talk about books, for the summer semester at Journeys Crossing, we're going to be starting small groups with the specific intention of reading one of those books or a book like that, and inviting people of diversity into that group so that you can get to know others, you can have these conversations. So if that's something that you're interested in, let us know at groups@journeyscrossing.org. And you're also welcome to start a group like that. I know that several of you are even in those groups. But this summer, as we move forward, I think that it would be a huge opportunity to learn and grow and connect using these groups. Some of this reading material would be one way to do that. Another thing we're doing is we'll be creating a task force that simply helps us as a church and our leadership keep this to the forefront. And Addie's going to be serving on that. If you'd be interested in participating in that, just email me, mark@journeyscrossing.org, and we'll start to form. And we're going to be doing some things over the next few months to continue this conversation. We want small groups where this becomes a focal point. We want to do some prayer walks and ask God to heal our country, our county, our nation. We're going to brainstorm. We're going to have more and more dialogue about this because this is the beginning. This isn't a one and done. So there's a number of things that all of us can do. And I think we're going to have more of this conversation tomorrow on our podcast. And one or two of you might be there either digitally or with us. So, and I don't know how much of this is going to go into the Sunday morning broadcast. So there may be even a section of this that gets archived or put on a YouTube channel if you want to watch the entire thing. If it didn't, I don't even know how much time we've spent. So we could spend a lot more. There's so much more we could talk about. And I want to, and we're going to. Thank you. Love you guys so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank
Love
you.
you too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Why don't I close with prayer? God, you made us all one. And you intentionally formed us, chose the color of our skin, the way our hair would curl, or it would be straight, the color of our eyes, our height, our abilities from sports to create, to design, to think. There's so much beauty in the humanity. And we were meant to live together to express that beauty fully. And we are sorry that we have failed. And God, we want to be your church. We want to be your church in better ways. We need your forgiveness, God, for not taking the concerns of our black brothers and sisters more seriously, for being indifferent or even apathetic, for those people of color with different ethnicities that we have simply coexisted with, and we haven't had the courage to step out of our own comfort to love them, to get to know them, to share their burdens and pain. Those are basic callings for everyone who follows you, Jesus. And this is a time for us to do that, just like you did, Jesus, for all of the people that are not being heard that live around us in Montgomery County, America, and around the world. Help us to be a people of justice, a people of peace, a people who are willing to step up, even if it might cost them, to have courage, to wrap their arms and their heart around somebody who may be different than them and listen and love them and to build them up. We ask your blessing on us as a church, God, and on each of these families represented. In Jesus' name, amen.